certainly, as we can tell, that certain styles of bell bottoms belong to John Travolta in the 70s. It's just that absolutely identifiable. Now here's one from a little earlier. This is from a storage chart, and it's got ridges in it of a type of rim that we only find in the 8th century BC. And actually in the second half of the 8th century BC, not the first half, the half that Isaiah lived in. Okay? This piece right here would be from the time of the prophet Isaiah. And we know that as certainly as we know that skinny ties were in vogue in the Ronald Reagan era. Here's some other ones. Now I've showed you a couple of rim types, and I'll show you a couple more. That's one, and this will surprise you, but because of the angle of it, because of the very, very excellent levigation of the clay and the color, but more from the rim style than anything else. We know that is a closed rim, the opening of a closed vessel that was about this tall, this wide, with two handles, from the Middle Bronze Age. This would be roughly 1700 BC. We'll give you the year on that. And that would be the time of Joseph in Egypt. Pass this around here. On the other hand, this rim, which to the naked eye would look pretty much the same, is of a slightly less high quality clay, although it's pretty good. And the fold on it is a little more rounded than that one and not quite as angular. And it's 400 years later. That's 1300 BC, and that is a Canaanite storage pot. But it's probably an import, okay? It's probably a Phoenician import, because the local ones don't have clay that good. So 400 years difference between those two, you can see just basically in that. Now, some pottery you can tell by the finish, okay? Here are, this is a rim sherd, but it also has a finish on it. It's a very beautiful honey mustard glaze with two brown lines in it and little specks of green glaze on top. And that is only, about 1,000 years old. That's the 12th century AD. That's Crusader ware right there. That's from when the Crusaders were in Jerusalem and had begun to introduce, well, not begun to introduce because it had been introduced in the early Islamic period, but glazeware on the pottery. We don't have any glazed pottery from the biblical period. It only comes in the medieval periods. There's some glaze. On the other hand, here is what we call a red slipped piece, where after the pot is thrown, it is dipped in some pottery sauce, I guess is the best way to say it. If you've ever done pottery, you know that you get this liquid that is a slip of the clay. And they would actually use that, certain clay colors, as a slip, as a finish, to give a kind of a color to the pottery. And then they would either leave it plain or they would burnish it. And because the burnishings, meaning the rubbings on that slip when it was dry but before it was fired, because the rubbings here are in an odd shape, they're not even in lines like you would get if you pulled the burnishing stone down when the pot was on the wheel, and they're not perfectly parallel as if it was wheel burnished, but these are hand burnished and they go in 2 or 3 different directions. We know that is pottery that is from the 9th century BC. Okay? And this is found both in the north and the south in Israel, and hand burnished red slip pottery is only from the 9th century BC. It does not survive into the 8th, and you do not see the burnishings in the 10th, only the 9th. Who lived in the 9th? Elijah the prophet. Okay, here are 2 painted pieces, just sherds. Well, that's actually one is a rim sherd too, but the paint on it is red and black, okay? And this particular type of a very crummy white slip with interesting designs painted in red and black is typical of the 11th century BC, only on the coast, not in the highlands of Israel. It's Philistine pottery. And this would be about the time of Goliath, if you like. And we call this Philistine bichrome, 2-colored bichrome. Okay? And then here's a piece that has a nicer white slip on it. It's actually made of a lighter colored, finely levigated clay. but it's got a brown kind of a hatched paint on it. And just that much of a piece tells me two things. A, it's from the late Bronze Age, again about 1200 BC. That would be the time of Moses and Joshua. And B, it wasn't even made in Israel. This is an import. This is from Cyprus. This is a Cypriot import that was being brought at the end of the late Bronze Age into Canaan. They didn't make those locally. And so I'll pass that way. Now, that's just an example of how very well we know the pottery indexes. And you know, there's still yet that he's making all that stuff up there. Yeah, I could be, but I'm not. It's the excellence of the pottery indexes that have been scientifically mapped and figured out over more than a century of archaeological research that helps us to feel fairly confident that we're dating the levels in which we find these potteries, these types of potteries, accurately. And again, one of the things that helps us to know what those different designs date from is that in those same levels we find other things that give us a fast date on them, a specific date. Inscriptions, for example, okay? That can be dated based on writing or based on historical event that might be linked to them. And this links also not only to the archaeology of Israel, but also Jordan and Syria and Mesopotamia and Egypt. And Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt were writing in almost all those periods, and we can find samples of writing either in Egypt or Mesopotamia that link to strata in which these potteries are found. So it's a big, big tapestry to put together, but I can guarantee you that the pottery indexes have become very, very good and help us to understand what we're doing. Now, some other shows and tells, just for fun, because I like you to handle stuff. We talked about the area of Timnah, which is, as you can see, in the borders near the Red Sea. It's just less than a day's walk from the Gulf of Aqaba shore. I suspect, more than anything else, that when Nephi said we came down to the borders near the Red Sea, he wasn't talking about the shore of the Red Sea as much as he was talking coming down to a place he knew, to Timnah. And that then specifically when he says we traveled 3 days further in the borders nearer the Red Sea, he's talking about actually coming to the seacoast and traveling down the east side. Now I showed you last week some of the beautiful wilderness landscape at Timnah near the Red Sea, and how they have these mines there that you can find the copper ore in. Well, what I didn't do was hand you around some of the ore. Did I? I don't think I did. Here's a hunk of stone that I grabbed out of one of these mines because it was free for the taking. And it's got a vein of copper ore running in it. This is the same type of a piece of rock by the basket loads that Nephi and Lehi and Sam and whoever else was actually involved in doing work in the family may well have gathered in a trip where they were gathering ore to produce copper. Now these aren't iron mines, okay, and they're not silver mines. In fact, they don't have any silver that's easily available in the land of Israel. You have to get it either from further north or from the Mediterranean area. It was mostly an imported metal. There's no gold in Israel either, but there is copper and there is iron. And if you were getting copper, you'd go to the Red Sea. I'm going to hand this around so you can see that vein. Yes?
During that time period, do we know if the Smiths mined it themselves, or was it something where they're miners who then smelted it usually, and then the Smiths took the already pure?
Well, I'm sure it was both ways. I'm sure it's both ways. The reason that I would suggest that Nephi and Lehi were not only smiths, because they can obviously do that, but also knew very well the mining technique and may very well then have been to Timnah on numerous occasions, is not only the fact that they seem to know their way to the Red Sea offhandedly, okay, whereas they don't know their way past the Valley of Lemuel. They need a Leahona to go anywhere. But that when Nephi gets to Bountiful, he needs, he has to have plans from the Lord to know, what kind of ship to build, but he knows how to mine ore. The only thing he needs to know from the Lord is where to go to find the ore, because he's not familiar with the bountiful area. But once he's told where to go, he knows how to mine the ore, he knows how to build the bellows, he knows how to do everything that's necessary to make his own tools. Now here is the ore. This will be copper ore. This is not iron ore, but copper. I'm not going to open this because it's hard. But that's after you crush the rock and pick out the little green pieces that are actually the ore itself. That's copper ore. And you have to crush tons of this rock, you know, presumably with other harder rocks like pieces of granite, in order to crush it into gravel and then pick out the green pieces that have the high concentration of the ore from all that white gravel. So this is a very time and labor intensive thing to do. But this is exactly the type of thing that Nephi would have to have done in order to find ore to make tools when you read 1 Nephi 17. But also, presumably, you know, he had done it a lot before, since he seems to know how to do it. And this would be how ore from these areas was crushed and then eventually being poured into a smelter to be boiled down into its liquid component. And we mentioned last week how that works. Okay? There are, in this park called Timna Park, archaeological remains of the smelters. Because you don't want to carry all that rock somewhere else to do it. In a case like Lehi, you don't want to carry all that stuff back to Jerusalem. All you want to carry back is the finished product. So you smelt on site. And this is just a patio area where you can see that they have reconstructed the elements of one of the smelters that they brought from out there. But you can walk out there and you can see places where there are 5 or 6 smelting locations. And you can see the circle in the ground where the smelter used to be. And you can see here stones that used to be the base of a bellows. And here you have a pole bellows. See, here you can see this, just a bag bellows that you would have, you know, done here. But here you've got an accordion bellows, okay, where you lift this up and drop it back down, and it forces air through a tube and into the smelter to feed rich oxygen onto that fire so it will burn hotter and melt that rock. Okay? So there's another type of bellows that we know was in use. Okay? And so into the smelter would go the ore mixed with charcoal, which is wood that's already been burned once and then been hardened and burnt into coke, charcoal, or even harder charcoal, which is called coke, not to be confused with my favorite drink. And then you'd light that on fire, feed it lots and lots of oxygen. It would heat up to a tremendous pressure and heat, and then melt all of that into molten metal with the molten rock with it. And then you had to drain off. The metal and the rock. And what happened here was the metal would be heavier than the rock. So you would drain off through little spigots out here that aren't shown here. You drain off that liquid into one basin where your ingot would form. And then when you started to see the molten rock coming out, that meant that your metal was exhausted. You shut off the pipe, and you would drain the molten rock into another basin. Now the metal, of course, would be a clump of copper. The rock would be a clump of slag. Slag's no good. You throw it away. You put the copper in your bag, and you take it back to Jerusalem. So out here, there are huge, can you see that little gray spot right there? Huge piles of slag from the smelting of these ancient smelters. And here is a piece of slag from that very one. And you can see what it is. It has a bottom like this, which was the bottom of the slag. This was the soil of the earth underneath the slag, presumably in a large basin. And this is the top of it. And you can see that the earth was kind of rounded underneath there. The slag flowed in hot molten form, and then it cooled. And when it cooled on top, it didn't cool evenly. You know, there were bubbles in it, and there were crevices, and there was a bubble along the edge. But at the bottom, it formed, you know, the form of the soil against which it sat. And it's very, very heavy. Okay? And this is a piece of ancient slag from the copper smelting industry right there at Timmins. Not unlike, you know, smelting that Nephi and Lehi would have done. So pass that around. You can see maybe just a little bit now more of the reality behind the story here in the Book of Mormon. And of course, we talked about metals last week and how silver and gold were also used as well. And I took you to the Israel Museum, so we won't do that. But questions now, before I move on for just a last few minutes here to make some textual observations.
Have you smelled it before?
I've smelled, but no, I have not smelled it personally. I have watched it done.
Okay.
Huh?
Yeah, that's cool.
Which is cool, yeah, but that's not like doing it yourself.
Yeah, you just-
I
you
think
see the
actually
metal
that
pool
with a few weeks training, I could maybe, with someone helping me, begin to get this. But this is something that's, you know, this is not easy stuff.
Did you watch like the metal pool, or did you see?
It takes a long time, but I watched the metal pool be drawn off and the slag be drawn off too. Yeah. This was way back in the 80s when they actually did a demonstration and we went to it. Well, this is, again, the area that's coming from Timnah right to the Red Sea. And this is an area that we love to stop at. It's the last big oasis before you get to the Red Sea. And I see some of Jerusalem students that aren't even students when I was there, you know, drooling over the ice cream bars that you get at the Yotvata. The fun thing about Yotvata is not only is it the oasis that's the closest to the Red Sea shore, so it's almost sure that Lehi would have stayed here, but not, you know, alas, he found no ice cream. Yotvata is actually the Hebrew name of the site in the Bible as well. It's called Jotbathah in the King James, Jothbatha or something, but it's actually Yotvata in Hebrew. That's it in Hebrew language. And they run a kibbutz down here, and they actually have enough water there underneath the soil that they can feed cattle. And they make their own dairy products and ice cream and chocolate milk is to die for. So we always stop there on trips to the Red Sea and have a treat. Okay. But the Israelites stopped here. You can see that in Numbers 33, and Lehi's family certainly would have to have done so as well. And then once you get past here, you're not in the borders near the Red Sea. You're there. Okay? So as we say, kaboom, to the place where Eilat and Aqaba are now, and then further down, 3 days further. There's the Red Sea, the nice group of people there, and you can see in the distance the city of Aqaba in Jordan. These folks are at the beach in Eilat, which is in Israel, and on the other side is Aqaba in Jordan. Let me go back one and show you, no, just one, and show you there's Aqaba, and there's Eilat. And you're really just right on the tip there, okay? Now, we think, almost everybody that models this thinks that Lehi comes through Arabia. So coming to the Red Sea, you'd have to have gone down the Arabian side, not the Sinai side. Okay? This picture is taken on the Sinai side. Technically, once we get this far down, we're on the Sinai Peninsula. Okay? We're only about 1.5 miles onto the Sinai Peninsula, but we're on the Sinai Peninsula. And we're looking across at the Arabian Peninsula there. And there's the city of Aqaba. So what you have to imagine now is Lehi getting there to the shore of the Red Sea, and instead of coming down our way here, he goes past what is now Aqaba, Jordan, and along the coast there, 3 days further to where the Valley of Lebanon would have been. So I don't know if some of you guys, when you went swimming down there, were thinking Book of Mormon, but when I go down there with students, I always give them a lecture on the Book of Mormon. It's really important. Okay, and there again is Aqaba, and here now you are in the Red Sea. But I always envision Lehi's family walking along there in the borders which are near the Red Sea. And so then on down, and past Aqaba, and over what is now the Jordanian-Saudi border, and past the Saudi city of Hakal, okay, down to the Bir Marsha area that you have seen on the map that we have located for right. The Saudi border between Jordan and Israel is about right here, by the way. So Lehi didn't have a visa, but was traveling in one day would be Saudi Arabia. Now,
Speaking of country borders, by the time they were at the Red Sea, were they already out of what they would have thought of as Israel? Or?
oh yeah, they're out of Judah, sure. Uh-huh.
Okay.
And once you get into this area, the area to the east of it here was Edom. Okay, in Josiah's time, this King Josiah, who ruled Judah till 609 BC. Josiah reestablished the Judean presence at Eloth, E-L-O-T-H, and had ships there. Though he clearly had annexed this part to Judah. After Josiah is gone, then Judah became weak again, and the travel possibilities within just a few years would have become more tenuous. Okay? But Edom was kept at bay from this area by Josiah's armies. Now, I can't take you into Saudi Arabia to Bir Marsha to show you the site that I think, or one of the wadis there that I think would be the best candidate for the Valley of Lemuel. Why? Saudis won't give me a visa. As you know, we live in a world when you're easily researchable on Google. And my whole life, academic life, has been involved with Israel. And every time I've applied for a Saudi visa, I get a very brief notice back in the mail which says, denied questionable associations. I went to Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and to the Saudis, that's a questionable association. So I cannot get over to the place that I think is the Valley of Lemuel, although some other people who aren't viewed as too Israeli have researched in Saudi Arabia, and we'll deal with that when we eventually in another class. But let me show you what I think the Valley of Lemuel would have looked like. Because as you can see, you've got a blue saltwater body here on the shore of what would have been the area of the Valley of Lemuel. And I want to take you back up here to En-Gedi, where there's also a very blue, salty body of water. On shore is a beautiful valley, the En-Gedi Valley, which just happens to be called in Hebrew, Nahal David, the Valley of David, because of a story in 1 Samuel 24 where David hid in this desert valley overlooking the Dead Sea. Just the way that the Valley of Lemuel would have looked over the Red Sea, and the river Laman would have emptied into the Red Sea. The Nahal David, the river of David in the Valley of David, empties into the Dead Sea. And so although they're two different locations, the visualities of them is going to be virtually the same. Desert valley, very small river of water, emptying into a wider, nice, beautiful blue river of water, with mountains on the other side, because on the other side from the Valley of Lemuel would have been the mountains of the desert Sinai. And on the other side of En-Gedi is the mountains of Moab in Jordan. So the visual experience will be similar to what you would have seen in the Valley of Lemuel. Before I do this, is a hand over here? Question? Okay, so here is Nahal David, the Valley of David, at En-Gedi. Now, how many have been to En-Gedi? Let me just see. See where all my travelers have been to En-Gedi. So see if this reminds you. And if Brother Judd did his duty, and if Brother Jackson did his duty, then you associated this with some Book of Mormon stuff, because this is how I trained you. It says, my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea. Now, if you're in a river valley, and a desert valley like this, and the river is flowing, it's got to be going more or less from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. Which means that if you're in the valley itself, and you're, anywhere in contiguous with the banks of that little teeny stream or river, you're at a higher elevation than the sea into which the river empties. Okay? So you're going to be able to look down that valley, and where the river here runs, of course, you can see because you can tell because it's green. So the vegetation grows where the water's running. And you can see that that empties out into that sea right there. So just the way that the rivers of the waters of the river Laman emptied into the Dead Sea, the waters of the river David here emptied into the Dead Sea. Pardon me, Laman emptied into the Red Sea, David's emptying into the Dead Sea, and mountains on the other side. So this view is like what Lehi or Nephi is describing. And it's really fun. Okay? You can see it's a valley too. Valley. It's a very narrow valley. It's not a valley like the Salt Lake Valley. It's a valley that basically harbors a river at the bottom. Why do I have no slide? Oh, I know why. Because I wanted to show you another altar of stone. Here's Abby at Arad. Did you guys get to go to Arad that were on the subscription? So you got to see this? There is an altar of stone at Arad, and this one is not hewn stone like that nice one I showed you from the museum. This is a little less well, shall I say, cut, but built to the specifics, you know, the cubit measurements of the altars mentioned for the tabernacle of Moses in the book of Exodus. Okay? And this then is a sacrificial altar at the little temple site there at the Tel Arad. And there's one of our good students there at that altar. I thought you would enjoy that. There's a piece of flint on top of the altar, a big flint slab. And it's actually flint, very hard stone. Not like it. Here's a bench too, on the south side of the altar. And those who excavated this, of course, understand this to be an altar of sacrifice, and it is understood then that there probably would have been some horns that have not been recovered from the four corners of this. But this slab of flint is probably where the animal was actually, well, how should I put this? You know, because it's a hard piece of rock. And you have to have that hard bottom, dare I say, cutting board for the operation with the animal. Okay? And the bench would have been where priests would have been able to stand, because the altar had to be so high, according to the law of Moses, in order to gain access to the top. So it's a very interesting thing there. And remember how Nephi built an altar of stones and they offered sacrifice? Well, you're probably looking at something, you know, not one of these little teeny-weeny campfire altars and, oh, I got a weasel, here he goes. They would have sacrificed a kosher animal, probably an ibex, okay, which are very, you know, on an altar large enough that corresponded to measurements you would know from the law of Moses. So that altar of stone is probably functionally not very different in size and utility from the one that Nephi and Lehi would have built in the altar to offer sacrifice. And they did this several times, because you read that every time something good happens, like the boys get back from Jerusalem, they do offer sacrifice. Now you're all going to want to go back and read those first Nephi chapters again now after we look at all this. Okay, enough of that. Let's do the Valley of Lemuel here for just a couple of minutes. This is something that I began doing with students years ago. We take them on this trip down to En-Gedi, down to the Nahal David, and we would make the climb, and we would talk about the adventures of David and Saul there, but you just couldn't possibly not talk about the Valley of Lemuel experience. So look at a couple of these things with me. Let's just start from the beginning, okay? Reading these passages from the text. It came to pass that he departed into the wilderness, with nothing with him, save for his family, provisions, and tents, and departed into the wilderness. So you leave Jerusalem, you head out the Wadi Draga, the Darga Valley, and you head southeast and head toward En-Gedi. And he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea and traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are near the Red Sea. Now, I'm doing this to see you came down. You come down to En-Gedi, you're 1,300 feet below sea level, the shore of the Dead Sea. Jerusalem's 2,700 feet above sea level. It's a 4,000 foot elevation drop. And then you travel south to the Red Sea. And it came to pass, when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river. Now, this verse is worded in a way that it could be misunderstood. So I'll just give you how I read this. I don't think that the valley is by the side of the river. Okay? The river would run in the valley. That's the way that geography works. It's his tent is pitched by the side of the river. And that's all in the valley. Okay? And that may seem a little less obvious, Chadwick, but it might not be obvious to everybody, so I'm just pointing it out. And this then is a desert valley that we call the Valley of David, Nahal David. Okay? And it says, it came to pass that he called the name of the river Laman. Now, you can't see it yet because this is a high-angle view, and the river actually is here. It is very small some days. It's small if you could step over it with a hop step. But there's enough water to spare in that river that in En-Gedi runs all the time for all the wildlife in the area and any humans that would ever need water. But it's running down there, and it's in some places it's almost obscured by all the vegetation that grows around, except for the time that I will tell you, and that's in winter. A winter like we're having now, where you have these huge, tremendous rains that rain up near Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and all that water rushes down the small little river, and it gathers in the main wadis like this and rushes out to the Dead Sea. And it's a muddy torrent that can sometimes get to be 6, 8, 10 feet deep. It wipes out everything along the shore of the river, going from something this big and this deep to something much wider than this room and higher than my head, with boulders and junk and chunks of dead wood and animal bones and everything flowing in it as it rushes. This is called a flash flood. And have you ever seen a good old southern Utah, Arizona flash flood? They're pretty scary. It's amazing how a little rain can funnel into those arroyos and cause a flash flood. Well, this happens in Israel all the time, every winter. And some winters, the En-Gedi Reserve will get wiped out. And a lot of the flora will be damaged, and it will grow back by summer because they have a flash flood in En-Gedi. Remember that. Okay. The valley was in the borders near the mouth thereof. This is hugely fun for me. We're on the shore of the Dead Sea here, okay? The valley of En-Gedi is right up there. Can you see how it goes between those two hills? That's the David Valley, the Nahal David of En-Gedi. But here, we're out on the shoreline. See, the mountains kind of stop right there, and there's a couple of 100 meters of just flat shoreline before you get to the actual edge of the Dead Sea. And what I'm not showing you here, if I aim the camera over this way, what you would see is lots of BYU students in their swimming suits bobbing up and down in the Dead Sea. Maybe you do that. No, I don't. I guess I want to keep. But what you've got here is a remarkable thing. Nephi says that the valley, meaning the Valley of Lemuel, was in the borders near the mouth thereof. The mouth of what? The mouth of the river Laman. Now notice he doesn't say that the valley was at the mouth of the river. He says the valley was in the borders near the mouth of the river. What he's describing is exactly what you can see here. That you have mountains in the desert, and then an area of coast, of beach that is not mountainous, but more or less flat, and then you finally have the shoreline of the beach itself. So that here is the valley, right there, and it's not at the mouth of the river. The river comes out of the valley and then runs along the flat beach for a couple hundred yards until it gets to the shoreline. So here the valley is in the borders near the mouth of the river. And here's the diagram for that, okay? I'm doing this as if it were on the Arabian side. So here's the high mountains, right? High walls, solid rock. Here's the valley. It actually starts right here, but there's a couple of hundred yards of beach line here. The river comes down here through the valley, but then it leaves the valley because it's leaving this line here and goes out and maybe even develops a small alluvial plain there, alluvial fan, as it empties into the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aqaba here. Now, this is amazing geography. And if you're one of those people that believes Joseph Smith made up the Book of Mormon, you have to ask yourself, how did Joseph know this? As far as being the nature of a desert wadi that empties into a body of water. How could Joseph have known, and how could he put into the mouth of Nephi that the river Laman emptied into the Red Sea, but the valley was in the borders near the mouth thereof? That's just offhand information that Nephi gives you because he's been there. He's just kind of trying to describe it for you. But how could Joseph Smith have known something like that? Well, years and years and years ago, when I read that passage of the Book of Mormon, and I thought of what the wadis are like here, I went, oh my gosh, this is amazing that Nephi includes this kind of detail, because it's exactly what we see. And again, to me, another proof that the book is authentic. Okay, so he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, traveled to the borders near the Red Sea. We talked about that before. Oh wait, I've gone backwards. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe I haven't. When my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, which we talked about, he exclaimed, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river, Laman, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness." I just wish you were like this river. So he uses these things to teach a lesson. And then he says to Lemuel, "Oh, that thou mightest be like this valley, firm, steadfast, and immovable in keeping the commandments of the Lord." Now look at that valley. Now look at those rock walls. Firm, and steadfast, and immovable. I mean, the verbal imagery is just there in the pictures that you see of these desert valleys. Okay, very quickly, one or two more. From the dream of Lehi, which seems to me to be based on real events that you have in the Valley of Lemuel. He's in the Valley of Lemuel when he has a dream. Dreams are very often taken from our real life events, but then are a little weird and fuzzy at the edges, and sometimes bizarre and off color. I don't know how your dreams are, but I have weird dreams all the time about stuff that's around me, except it doesn't look just exactly in my dream the way it does in reality. It's different. Sometimes it's scary. From the dream of Lehi, he says, "I beheld a river of water." Can you see the water right there? It's actually in a waterfall right there, and there's another waterfall of it, so it's actually coming down in waterfalls. And it was near the tree of which I was partaking the fruit. And there's the river again. And I beheld a rod of iron. And it extended along the bank of the river, and it led to the tree by which I stood. Now, here we don't have, at the Engedi Reserve in Valley of David, a rod of iron. We have a rod of stainless steel. But it performs essentially the same function. Okay. It's for safety. It's so you don't fall in to that stream. I also beheld a straight and narrow path, which came down by the rod of iron, even to the tree by which I stood. Now notice something about this path. It's straight and narrow. Oh, it's not straight, S-T-R-A-I-G-H-T. It's straight, S-T-R-A-I-T. A word which means narrow. Now, mostly when you see art about the Book of Mormon, it looks like that. A straight, S-T-R-A-G-H-T, rod. And for some reason, It's kind of like way far away from the river and not even in the valley, which is the way that Mormon painters paint it. I'm not trying to be that critical, but that's just the way you usually see it, right? But notice that the river of water, let me see if I can get this, the rod of iron that is extended along the bank of the river. The rod is actually by the river. It's not way up away from the river like in some of the art we do. It's right there at the edge of the river. It's on the bank. And it led to the tree. So this is happening in the valley, next to the river. And it's also a straight and narrow path. This is a way of saying narrow twice. It's a straight path and it's a narrow path, meaning it's a really narrow path, a straight and narrow path. Nephi was doing here what Isaiah does. He's using synonyms to describe something. It's a synonymous description, saying the same thing twice with synonyms. Because in any situation where you will buy a real river in the desert, that river doesn't flow in a straight line. It goes where the terrain goes. And if the trail in the rod is on the riverbank, it will have to go where the terrain goes as well, just like it does in the in Getty Park. And eventually it leads to the head of the fountain, which is where you will all get in trouble if you try to climb the cliffs. But beautiful water. So, like I say, no matter what art you look at, they all paint it as a straight rod. Every Mormon picture I've ever seen. But the reality is more something like this that you see in the Engedi. And the river is down here a little bit in this case because the bank rises straightly up. And the trail goes where it will allow you to run. But the authorities have put that rod there, and it's winding, but it's by a straight, narrow path. And this is the reality that's probably behind the dream, rather than kind of the art that you see. Okay? And you hold on to that for safety. You hold to that rod. It's strong and bright and true. So this is kind of the image that you would get. I beheld others press forward, and they came forth and caught hold of the rod of iron. And they did press forward through the mist, clinging to the rod of iron. Now let me just tell you one more thing that I don't have a picture of. I actually do, but I didn't import it here for some reason that I don't know. It's when this little beautiful rivulet turns into an ugly, horrible, brown, foamy, looking like junk-filled chocolate milk, raging torrent. Do you remember what Nephi in 1 Nephi 15 told his brothers that the river looked like, that his father had failed to know because he was caught up in the other things in the vision? Nephi said the river was filthy. Yeah. And that it was dangerous. The whole idea was that the river was dangerous to cross. This actually isn't very dangerous to cross. But at flash flood stage, after a winter storm, it's horribly dangerous. And this was a dream about the danger for Lehi, that they could get, trying to get to that great and spacious building, they could get washed away in the torrent. There was danger to his family, filthy danger. And that too, I have seen it in Getty, and I'll try to bring the picture of it next week. But that too is a reality of these desert wadis after a storm, which lets you know that they had spent some winter time in the valley of Lemuel, very probably for Lehi to have that association in his brain. Well, anyway, I thought that I would just show you those things, and let me do, you have time for one more. See that? Food.